Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to all of you, online, offline, from far away and close by, and especially to those from far away and very far away here at Munich's Amerika-Haus. My name is Carsten Fitz. I'm a professor of American Studies at the University of Passau, about 2 hours from here by train, and a board member of the Bavarian American Academy. And it is with great pleasure that I welcome you here to a panel. You can see it there on the screen. On the Past is Never Dead, U.S. Perspectives on History, Memory, and Current Challenges. And challenges, especially in the transatlantic relationship, there seem to be quite a few these days. Let me briefly, for those of you who do not know the Bavarian American Academy, say a few words on our academy. The BAA is an interdisciplinary academic organization founded in 1998 and part of the Amerika-Haus Munich, whose main aim is to provide a scholarly network for researchers working on North America in a very broad scope. Our members come from various disciplines: literary and cultural studies, history, geography, political science, economy, law, philosophy, musicology, or art history. For those around Munich and from Bavaria, you should attend one of our very interdisciplinary annual conferences, usually in July. A word of thanks to two people before Andreas will take over. One is Andreas Edkes, my dear colleague from the LMU, the Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität, the Amerika-Institut, who has pulled this together with Irmgard Zündorf, head of knowledge transfer and university cooperation at the Leibniz Center for Contemporary History at Potsdam. Andreas will also be the moderator and introduce this larger scope here. This is a kickoff, so to speak, for a one-week event on critical memory, and this is the only public event within that 1 week of intensive exchanges and networking. Maybe to close, when we introduce ourselves this morning to each other, coming together as a group for the very first time, at least 4 or 5 people said one sentence that I would like to take as an inspiration for tonight's panel. I came here to think with you. And I think that's a wonderful kind of kick-off. Let's think together, and let's you 4 and 5 actually, including Andreas Edkes, generate some of the thoughts, some of the strands, collect some of the ideas that are currently on the agenda when it comes to history, the past, and commemoration. Andreas.
Thank you very much. Yep. Thank you very much, Carsten. Welcome to all of you here at Amerika-Haus and those watching this on their screens in Germany, the US, or elsewhere. A big thanks to our host today, the Bavarian American Academy. And also this event is also, and there will be a reception afterwards for those who are here, also sponsored by Munich's Documentation Center for the History of National Socialism. There are several other organizations listed here that are involved and were among the key organizers. There's actually several more, which shows you something about the scope of this event. The KZ-Gedenkstätte Dachau, Flughafen Tempelhof in Berlin, Topographie des Terrors in Berlin, the National Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta, the Carter Center in Atlanta, the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, and the International Nuremberg Principle Academy. Tonight's event, as you heard, is part of a larger project on building a critical memory. And the project brings together about 25 American and German scholars, curators, public historians, civil society leaders, journalists, and others who spend a whole week in Germany, starting in Munich. Tomorrow we'll be in Dachau, then we'll be in Nuremberg, and then we'll move on for several days to Berlin. We're actually, and I don't like to contradict you or correct you, we'll have another public event for the Berlin audience as well. The project was 2 years in the making, and while we were convinced of the value throughout, we did not, I think no one anticipated the urgency this topic has taken on since Trump took office for the second time on January 20th this year. There's so much to talk about, and I'm glad I can do this with a group of wonderful panelists tonight. You will later have the chance to ask questions here in the room, and also those who are online by using slido.com. And I don't know if we're going to show the QR code, so you can also use the QR code and then later ask questions that will be sent to me here. I don't know who read the news that came here yesterday or today, and partly yesterday. Again, a new urgency to this project. Donald Trump signed another executive order, this time an attack on history, in the truest George Orwell 1984 doublespeak. The title of the executive order is Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History. And attacking the Smithsonian Institution, attacking the Park Service, attacking the historical profession for supposedly kind of rewriting American history in a way that does not make Americans proud anymore, talking too much about race, making people feel bad about this. We're going to go talk about this executive order in a moment too. The current developments have impacted this endeavor in other ways too. We would have had the chief historian of the National Park Service in Germany with us and someone else from the Park Service. They aren't allowed to do international travel right now. In between, and some of you might have seen this in the announcement, Lonnie Bunch, he's called the secretary of the Smithsonian, but basically he's the head of the more than 20 museums and many, many other institutions that belong to it. He was supposed to come. He canceled a few days ago. And very likely he had a hunch something like this would be happening, and he just couldn't be outside of the country. So history is under attack, like so many other things in the United States. I'm very proud to be on a panel with such a distinguished group of Americans. I'll keep the introductions brief because we want to get into a conversation. Next to me is Margaret Huang, the president and CEO of the Southern Poverty Law Center in Montgomery, Alabama. Next to her is Jim Grossman, the executive director of the American Historical Association, who already reacted in several different ways in his organization to just an hour ago, there was a quote in a New York Times article by him, for example. Desiree Cormier-Smith, the co-founder and principal of the Alliance for Diplomacy and Justice, and Kamar Pierce, the chief program officer for the National Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta. I'd like to start with a question where you introduce a little bit the work of your institution and also why history matters to you. Why does history matter to the Southern Poverty Law Center? The title kind of doesn't give it away.
All right, wonderful. Thanks so much for the question, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this important and timely conversation. The Southern Poverty Law Center was founded in 1971 as a reaction to the civil rights laws that had been passed in the United States in the 1950s and 60s. And what we observed in the southern states where we are based is that many government agencies, many institutions, okay, is this better? Thank you.
It works.
Okay. Many institutions were not complying with those civil rights laws. And so we decided to start a small law office to sue those agencies and those institutions into complying with civil rights mandates. Fast forward, 50 plus years later, why does history matter today? Well, many of you may know that Alabama and the states around us were part of the Confederacy, were part of the Civil War, the part of the Civil War that was fighting for the preservation of slavery. That history was actually captured by a journalist named Edward Pollard, who in 1866, a year after the Civil War ended, wrote a book that said, even if we lost the Civil War on the battlefield, we could still win in the war of ideas. And he laid out, his book was called The Lost Cause. And The Lost Cause laid out a vision for how we could preserve the racial hierarchies that were being demanded by the Civil War Confederates. That has been the guidebook for so many people in the South over the last more than 150 years. And it not just persists today, but is making a very strong recurrence. And that is what we're seeing with the executive order that Andreas has already talked about. We saw it on the campaign trail when Donald Trump romanticized racial and gender hierarchies in his campaign commitments. And we're seeing it now in a whole host of ways from both private institutions and more recently now with the new administration with public agencies and their effort to erase parts of history that are inconsistent with their own values. And that is why, as a civil rights advocate and a legal organization that has sued to preserve and protect civil rights, history matters. I'm going to stop.
Thank you. Well, Jim, in your case, the question seems to be obvious. But then if people think of a historical association, so you organize academic conferences, you administer or do support thousands of members, of highly educated members who write detailed studies full of footnotes. But I think especially also under your leadership, as an executive director for now 14 plus years, 15 years now, the organization has changed in many ways. Can you give us an idea of how you define your job and the mission of the American Historical Association, besides writing new...
I'll quote my friend Sam Weinberg. Some of you know his work. Sam says, I organize historians. So there's my job.
Okay.
The American Historical Association is the only organization chartered by Congress to promote historical work in the United States. And we take that charter very seriously. That's what we do. We get involved in state legislatures, the Congress, only on behalf of history. So when people say, are you a political organization, not political, we get involved in politics on behalf of history, on behalf of the work of historians. Not other things. There may be other things that people are interested in, that people think are important, but our legitimacy to argue on behalf of the centrality of history to public policy, it depends upon us making it clear that that is our central, our only interest in the classical sense. I think it's important, the question that you asked, why history matters. History always matters. Everything has a history. Chairs have a history. These microphones have a history. You can't understand anything unless you understand its history. And so what our argument is on behalf of history in public culture and in government is that if you don't understand historical context, you cannot make an intelligent decision. So we do, for example, congressional briefings. We brief congressional staff on history. We are not telling them how their members should vote. We are not pushing a policy on the issue. But when you have congressional staff who we had a briefing on immigration, for example. Congressional staff didn't know that the door was closed for 40 years. Never mind why that mattered. So the argument is it is imperative for them to understand this history. Mm-hmm. And I think in terms of where you started here, the reference to the recent executive order, what people don't realize is that patriotic history can take place in places where there is a heavy dose of criticism. Mm-hmm. Patriotic history is history that helps people become good citizens and that helps decision makers make good decisions. Think about going to your doctor. If you go to your doctor, there's something wrong with you. If you hide your past, if you hide the things that are embarrassing, but that could have been the reason why you have this wound, this illness, your doctor's not going to be able to help you. So a patriotic history is one where people, policymakers or not, learn how we got here. Why are we a divided people? What kind of reasons can we find for the polarization that you cannot deny that the United States is divided right now, and Germany as well. If you want to understand those divisions, you damn well better understand the past, the evolution of those divisions. Otherwise, healing them is hopeless.
We'll come to the healing part later and see how far we can get. Desiree, until January 17th, if I got that right, you worked for the State Department as the first and likely for a while only special representative for racial equity and justice in, again, the US State Department. I'm not going to ask you why you left on January 17th, but how does history matter to the State Department, and how did it for the work you did?
Yeah, thank you. You know, I think Jim summed it up perfectly. We cannot do racial justice work without an understanding of history, right? We cannot understand why there are inequities in health, in education, in housing, in labor, in employment, right? Without understanding how we got there. And so the work that I did as the special representative for racial equity and justice had to be rooted in history and a truthful telling of our history. And I think one of the reasons why I was received so well around the world, which was surprising to me, right? Because the U.S. has a lot, to make it a gross understatement, the U.S. has a lot of issues in terms of racial inequities and injustices. So there were concerns that by creating this position, we would be sending the message, creating this position in the State Department, we would be sending the message that we did nothing to see here at home, this is a foreign policy problem. Right? To the contrary, I was very intentional about really underscoring that my position was created and I occupied that position because we recognized that while we had very real challenges on racial inequities in the United States, we were not the only ones. This was truly a global problem. And as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, put it, I believe last year, no country in the world is immune to racism. And so I thought there was no clearer argument for my role, right? And for me, it was very important to engage in the work with great humility and with great honesty about the history of the United States and the current challenges, and how those current challenges were a direct legacy of our history of the genocide of Native American people and the enslavement of Africans and their descendants, right? And that's how we got to where we are. And by doing that, I was welcomed with open arms around the world because for once, not for once, but they were very, they were happy to hear such honesty, even when it was uncomfortable, coming from a representative of the United States government. And I was very proud to work in the Biden-Harris administration where that honesty in terms of my role was encouraged. Right? And I would often use direct quotes from President Biden saying, you know, great countries don't hide from their history, they confront them, and that's how they're able to do better. And when I would say that, people would look shocked, and I'd say, no, that's not a quote from me, that's a quote from the president, so it's okay, I can say it. But without that understanding of history, without that willingness to sit in that discomfort for some people about our history, there's no way I could have engaged in that work. And by doing so, it allowed me to build bridges with communities who were oppressed, whose histories were trying to be erased, but it also allowed me to build bridges with government representatives and members of majority populations that didn't necessarily want to engage in those uncomfortable conversations if they were the only ones being honest about their history, right? Or about the inequalities and inequities in their countries. So by disarming them, by saying, hey, I'm not here to lecture you, I'm not here to admonish you, I'm here to acknowledge that we have a lot of shared problems, and it looks like specifically on housing, you know, there seems to be a lot of housing disparities. How can we share best practices? How can we share lessons learned with each other? It's not me telling you that I have all the answers. I'm saying that we have very similar issues in the United States, and we see you've made progress on it. How can we learn from you? And there may be things we can share with you that you can incorporate, right? And so that is what made, I think, the work so impactful, so important. And so it really is a real shame that on his first day in office, I mean, this was one of the core things that he demonized, right? Equity, diversity, equity, and inclusion. What is so awful about diversity, equity, and inclusion? And so I think that could be another conversation. I'll stop there, but I will just say, again, I could not have done the work without a clear understanding of history and a willingness to be very honest about it.
Thank you. Kema, the title of the institution you work in is Civil and Human Rights, and the logo we use on our program has the terms truth and transformation.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about what are the goals of that, and again, where does history?
Absolutely. So at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, we are a museum first, and you need a place and space to tell the history. But we use that history also to do the real work, and we have many programs.
History is not the real work. No,
I
just
mean,
kidding.
you know,
for me it is. No, just kidding.
Those of us that love museums, you know, but there is a portion of the world that thinks, oh, museums boring. But we need that history. We need to codify it. We need to make sure that, and this current administration knows that. That is why they are going after museums and libraries, and you know, they know the power, okay, of place that tell these stories. And part of our museum, we have outreach programs and different initiatives that are actually walking the talk. And one of those programs is Truth and Transformation. And in that program, we are actually working with the community and with our city government in Atlanta to uncover some history that it's either hidden by purpose or just by circumstance. So a perfect example of that is the 1906 Atlanta Race Massacre. How many of you all know that we had one in 1906? Not just Tulsa. In fact, there were hundreds of massacres that occurred as a response to Reconstruction and to progress of enslavement, and the way to keep these growing African-American communities in check at the end of the 1800s and 1900s was to wipe out that history, to wipe out that community. And one of those communities was Atlanta. And the result of that massacre really pushed back a lot of the growth of the black middle class that was happening at that time at the turn of the century. Positive things happened too. Sweet Auburn was born, and that is where Dr. Martin Luther King was born and raised, and a lot of civil rights leaders, but it really was a halt. And no one knew this history. Now, every school child in Georgia does. It is part of the curriculum. And we have it part of our museum, and we are working with, and this started grassroots. It was people in the community who were passing the story down from generation to generation, but no one was talking about it. And that is why what's happening right now is really hard for those of us that work in this space, because we finally got to a place, and I'll just talk about the United States, where we started owning our history. We're just beginning to own our history. I don't know if many people know the Statue of Liberty's history. I have a colleague that always says this, you know, bring us your poor, bring us, you know, it's about immigration and it's about our country's open. But I don't know if many people know that the architect, the French architect of the Statue of Liberty was actually an abolitionist and actually supported President Lincoln. And in the first iteration of the Statue of Liberty, she's holding chains in her hand because he's celebrating the end of slavery. It ended up at the feet, and we've kind of rewritten the symbol of Statue of Liberty to just, you know, and it's still important for immigration and for welcoming immigrants, but it also had to do with celebrating the end of slavery and many Americans don't even know that piece of history of our Statue of Liberty. So why is the question we need to, ask ourselves. And we were just beginning as a nation to uncover this. And so they know that, and that is why we're seeing this backlash.
I wanted to pick up anyway on what you just said, because I don't just want to focus on the pushback. I think I've been teaching US history in Berlin and Munich for 25 years. And while I would say in the historical profession there was for a much longer time, there had been a lot of critical studies, I think in history, in the public sphere and the public history, there have been major changes. And in the past few years, again, I mean, maybe you can talk a little bit about the Southern monuments reports you've been doing. Flags have come down, monuments have come down, and the executive order also includes the asking the Secretary of the Interior to restore Confederate monuments that were taken down in the last several years. The National Park Service widened what they focus on. African American history, slavery. There's one park even that has massacre in the title, Sand Creek Massacre against Native Americans. LGBTQ+, so it widened its mission. The Smithsonian, most prominently Lonnie Bunches, as a founding director, Museum of African American History and Culture, that stands out by its beginning with its architecture. So tell us all a little bit about where, and you started to do this, where there was a lot of progress. I think things started to change in Washington, but elsewhere in the country too. And the lynching memorial as it's kind of more colloquially called, maybe in Montgomery, Alabama, I think, again took this another step further by focusing and not just celebrating history, but really focusing on criminal history. Where would you see the progress that was done in the last 20 or more years in telling history? Who wants to start?
Sure, thanks. The reason I started with a little background on the Confederacy and the Civil War is because in 2015, there was a mass murder that occurred in Charleston, South Carolina, when a young man who was inspired by Confederate imagery and idolatry went into a church and killed 9 people in a mass murder. And when he did that, he cited the inspiration of the Confederacy. The next year, in 2016, the Southern Poverty Law Center produced a report called Whose Heritage? And we wanted to look at the state of Confederate memorials in the United States. What we learned is that there are still more than 2,000 Confederate memorials all across the country. 1,900 of them are in the Deep South, where the Confederacy was so powerful. But that also means that there are a couple of hundred other places in the country that were not part of the Confederate War that have Confederate memorials, and that's worth lifting up. The vast majority of the memorials in the United States were erected from 1900 to 1920. It was not immediately following the war. It was during the height of Jim Crow. And the purpose of those...
Can you say what's meant by Jim Crow for
yes,
those who...
Yes, of course. So Jim Crow was a set of laws and practices, particularly in the South, but not only in the South, that mandated segregation and required separate but equal, so-called equal, facilities and services for blacks and whites across the South. And at the height of that is when these memorials were built, with the intention of making sure that black folks in the South understood their place. So this iconography exists today. It's still rampant. We still have more than 2,000 memorials across the country. And that history continues to inspire. We have now, we've done 3 editions of the report. And to try to get to your question, you asked what are some of the successes. So actually, between the period of 2015, when the massacre took place, and 2022, more than 350 memorials were taken down or moved to another site to provide more context, or just eliminated altogether. And that is some incredible progress over those 7 years. We are now seeing a backlash. And one of the successes we saw was in 2023 under the Biden administration. The military renamed 9 bases that had been named after Confederate generals, which is really astonishing if you think about it, that the U.S. military would name bases after their opponents in the Civil War. They renamed those 9 bases, and they created a naming commission made up of people from the military and other historians and others to pick new names. And within the first month of this Trump administration, they have already renamed 2 of those bases back to the original Confederate names.
But they claim that they're not. They're using the same name, and they're saying, oh, it honors somebody else.
Well, there was a law passed in 2020 with bipartisan support, so both Republicans and Democrats supported it. They passed a law saying we should not name bases after people we fought against in wars. So they couldn't rename them after the Confederate generals. So they found another veteran with the same name and named it after that veteran who has never before been known. And in fact, the Wikipedia page for that person was launched the day before the announcement. So that's how they're getting around the law. But the reality is that this is the push that we're seeing. We're seeing the push not just to return to the idolatry that was set up before, but this is the push to actually reinstitute some of the same practices and ideology that we've been fighting for so long.
And the Base Renaming Commission is a really good example of how, when you start rethinking history, and by the way, this is revisionism. Revisionism is not lying. Revisionism is when you ask new questions and find new data. None of you want to have a heart operation by a doctor who's not reading revisionist medicine. It shows what happens because when these bases were renamed, they didn't go out and find some other hero. They did. They didn't go out and find some other former general. What they did was they redefined what heroism is, which had a tremendous impact on ideas about gender, on ideas about patriotism. So one of the bases, they took the Confederate general's name off, and they put on the person who, in essence, rethought the ways in which people could send mail to soldiers serving abroad. Suddenly, that person was a hero. That is not what people think of as heroes. And that's a deeply gendered set of issues. So I think that these things then stretch out. And what's important to remember about this, Margaret, you were so generous to them. We need to remember that these were military bases named after people who had committed treason. They hadn't just fought against the army. They had committed treason. And they had committed treason in the interest of the right of some people to own, buy, and sell other people, and not over states' rights. And so when put that starkly, what we have found is that some people say, oh, gee, I didn't realize that. I thought this was all about heritage. It's not. It's about making a hero out of someone who committed treason in the interest of being able to buy, sell, and own human beings. And you have to put it that starkly. And I think when you look at all the renamings that did take place, that's a tremendous victory. I mean, this was ridiculous. There were places in Arizona that had named things after Confederate generals in the 1940s. Why? Because President Truman had integrated the armed forces with an executive order, and this was a direct attack on that. Because the other period of the renamings is after Truman integrated the armed forces, and even more after Brown versus Board of Education. After the Supreme Court had ruled that segregated school, that separate but not equal was not constitutional, then what you saw was schools renamed after famous Confederates. So this had nothing to do with honoring the Confederacy. These were deliberate political acts.
The state of Georgia changed the state flag in the 1950s, including parts of the Confederate
So
flag.
I think reversing this is, in fact, I agree, it's a tremendous victory.
The Park Service starting to include slavery in the narrative of the parks, for example, was another one.
I mean, you know, joining the Biden administration after the first Trump term in 2021 and working in the Bureau of International Organization Affairs on how we can re-engage in a positive way the UN system and rejoin the Human Rights Council, and working with the career folks who were very relieved to be able to rejoin the UN and all these bodies and the Human Rights Council, but the reaction and the shock on their face when I would say, okay, we need to, you know, in these remarks, if it's about, you know, or, you know, this is the National Day to remember slavery, we need to send out a statement. And we can't do that because they were so afraid to be honest about the ugly parts of our history that made some people uncomfortable. It actually was disturbing to see how traumatized they were. And so I'm really afraid for the whiplash and what that means, not only for our bilateral relations, right? How we've seen how in only a few months they've been so denigrated and damaged, but also what that means for the career folks who now were finally able to engage with their global counterparts in an honest manner about the history of the United States, what's going on in the United States, and how that is a part of our, you know, legacy of our history, and explain to their global counterparts. Now they are not able to use words like underrepresented communities. This is just bizarre. It really undermines their ability to be effective in their work globally as well as at home, right? And again, if we cannot use history to explain why there are these inequities that exist between, say, for instance, maternal mortality rates between black and white women, or black, white, and Native American women in the United States, that could contribute to the belief that somehow there's something wrong with black women. There's something wrong with Native women that is allowing them or causing them to die at higher rates. It's nothing systemic here. It's something wrong with them. And we can obviously extrapolate that example and apply it to education, right? Why are there worse educational outcomes for black students? Something must inherently be wrong with them.
And, you know, it's funny because, not funny, but, you know, the power of narrative is huge. And what this administration understands, these terms and these labels and how it's being communicated has real power. And today, Andreas, because we had the opportunity to go through Munich and walk, and all of the memorials that you have and all the acknowledgement, it means something to have a space and place where you're saying this happened here. And what we're trying to do in the United States right now is erase and ignore that. But that's always been the history of the United States. And there's trauma in our soil that has never, ever been dealt with. And we're going back to that when we're just beginning to listen to, and it's not just an African-American white story. We have a story of indigenous people in our country. We have Latino communities, LGBTQ. I mean, people just found out who Byron Rustin was just recently. He was a gay man that planned the March on Washington in 1964 and was an advisor to Dr. Martin Luther King. And we just really are hearing about that the past year or two. It's crazy. But that's because the power of narrative, who's telling the story and what story we are telling, has power. And they understand that. And what we're seeing with these orders, what was the title? It's getting back to sanity.
Restoring truth and sanity to American history.
Their sanity.
Yes.
Right? But that is such a small representation of who we are as a people. And, you know, it is bringing us back. I want to be optimistic here, though. The top has been opened. The door has been opened. The history has been done. And so, yes, orders are good, but people know their history, want to know their history. How do we learn some of this history? Some of it has been through quilting. Enslaved women would quilt their family stories and pass it down. Every culture, music, writing, the door is opened. And so we have to just continue to push, because there is not going to be any reckoning in our country until we own the trauma. And it wasn't you, it was your ancestors, okay? But it's important that we all own our part and our place in history, or we are not going to be able to heal as a nation.
I mean, whoever wants to answer that. DEI, diversity, equality, inclusion, that was already mentioned, and that was, I think, one of the very first executive orders Trump signed, maybe even the first or the second one.
Yeah.
Can you explain a little bit to, at least mostly probably German audience, what is really meant by this? What difference has that made to start understanding why this has been targeted so much?
Nobody can explain that because it means something.
I mean, there's a whole list too. White
means,
privilege. I mean, you know.
Well, it means something different to everybody.
Okay.
And I think that's the crucial piece.
That's right.
That teaching African American history is not DEI. Right. It's teaching history. Mm-hmm. Doing sensitivity trainings is DEI. Is diversity. Those are labeled diversity, equity, inclusion programs that corporations, nonprofits, government does. The literature on that, quite frankly, is extremely ambiguous. It is not clear whether those programs work. Those programs are controversial. Mm-hmm. That is something that's over here, and it's important to discuss it in public. Do they work? Do they not work? Why do they work? Why do they not work? What is clear, what is completely different from that, is that teaching the history of women, gay people, African Americans is not DEI. It is history. Mm-hmm. So I think you need to separate these two things. And what a lot of people, quite frankly, on the left and the right, are unable to do is to separate these two things. Mm-hmm. That as historians, we are here to teach history of everybody. Mm-hmm. That's not DEI.
I think that's an incredibly important point. The problem is, this administration isn't necessarily interested in facts, right, and the truth, despite what they want to call this most recent executive order, which is just gaslighting on a national level, right? Mm-hmm. Truth and sanity, you just call it restoring your own white people's comfort, right, and how we talk about history. But the attack on on diversity, equity, inclusion is particularly infuriating because it is so ambiguous. And so it has had this chilling effect on folks because they don't,
that's right.
Right? This administration doesn't understand what diversity, equity, inclusion is. And so they have used it, similar to woke, as a catch-all phrase to apply to anything that is not related to white, straight Christian men. And by being so intentionally ambiguous in these executive orders, they are able to really eliminate anything that happens to benefit Black people, women, LGBTQI plus folks, persons with disabilities. Let's not even, as my former counterpart on disability rights would say, we're so invisible they forgot the A, the accessibility. Right? But this order has been so broadly applied and so ambiguous that it goes beyond these workplace trainings to now impact any program that happens to benefit anyone who is not a white, straight Christian man. And it has been so devastating around, not only in the United States, but I'll talk about from foreign policy because that's where I most recently come from, that it means that any foreign assistance program that happen to benefit any of these categories, God forbid they benefited gay people, right? Even if they were providing life-saving support, cut because they were in violation of this DEI order. It's just awful, the cruelty and the devastation. And it really does go to the fact that only certain lives matter to this administration.
But also culturally, because, so yes, there's that piece. There's money's taken away, programs are being cut, but we also have people who are losing their jobs or being told that they are less qualified because they're DE&I hire, which is basically everyone. You know, your DE&I hire has become this curse word in the United States, you know? I almost want to pull out my LSAT scores and say, did you make 95 percentile? So, you know, like, it's insane. And that piece is so permeating in the culture right now that I am very concerned about, you know, where we are headed. And I'm going to ask you from the legal standpoint, you know, because it's hitting us culturally as well.
Absolutely. Well, I actually wanted to talk about the educational piece, which all of us do in our different roles. And for us, some of the worst attacks have been in the educational system, accusing schools of practicing bad DEI woke policies. Recently, there was a teacher in Idaho who put out a sign on the outside of her classroom saying, "Everyone is welcome." And she was ordered by the school system to take it down because it was promoting inclusion, it was promoting diversity, and it was promoting equity. Children, yeah. So this is a very consistent problem. One of the organizations that we have been tracking in the United States as part of our annual reporting on hate and extremism is a group called Moms for Liberty. And this is a group that has been organizing local chapters across the United States with the purpose of taking anything that might upset their children out of the classroom. I'm actually not sure that the children are upset. The children seem to be just fine, but the parents are very upset about the teaching of these principles of inclusion and being open to hearing about people with different families, different experiences, different people they love in their lives, and that is something that creates a threat to the heteronormative mainstream.
And it's not even clear that they're parents. This is one of the interesting things about Moms for Liberty and about a lot of this activism at the local and state level. American Historical Association did a survey about 4 or 5 years ago, and it turns out that most Americans, and this includes Republicans, do think children should learn these uncomfortable aspects of history. 60, 70% of Americans, and I said Republicans as well as Democrats. It is not clear how much the Moms for Liberty have children in the schools. Some of them are people who are my age and their children have aged out of schools. Some of them are people with children in parochial and private schools. So one of the things is that the interesting use of words here is it's constantly talked about as parents, and some of these are not. The stuff that these people are arguing for also is difficult. Someone referred to the chilling effect before. So one of the things they want is legislation that says that you cannot teach, and this has been enacted in roughly 20 states, you cannot teach that one race is inherently superior to another. Think about that. The first thing that does is it's a push-pull. Because if you say, we need to introduce legislation that says you cannot teach that one race is superior to another, that implies that that's what's being taught. Unfortunately, the American Historical Association has actually done research into what is being taught in classrooms, and it turns out that's not being taught. But the second thing is, imagine a teacher talking about the Jim Crow era that Margaret was just talking about. So you're a teacher, and you want to explain to the students that for a century or more, Americans were taught in schools that one race is superior to another, and that American law said one race is superior to another. Okay. The law says you cannot teach that one race is superior to another. So I am a teacher, and my tenure, quite frankly, is not as effective as tenure in higher education. And I'm thinking, okay, the law says I can't teach that one race is superior to another. Can I teach that the law used to say that one race is superior to another? How much do I want my job? How much do I want people throwing things at my house? So there's a chilling effect that has to do with the ways in which these laws, and Moms for Liberty was offering bounties. In New Hampshire, Moms for Liberty was offering a $500 bounty to anybody who turned in a teacher.
And the teachers they're scared in the United States. So, we were, and I'm in the South, we work closely with our teachers, and, teachers want to just educate their students. And history is bipartisan. You might not like what you're hearing, but history is history. And they want to teach it, but they're terrified of losing their job or, having parents come after them. And they need support. And it's a real problem because we have talented people leaving the profession. And where does that leave our children in the United States?
We've talked a lot about the backlash that is going on. We talked a little bit also about what the things, how they seem to go, at least to some degree, into the right directions. What are your institutions, or what are you doing or thinking about? If one looks at, I mean, and we are a little further away, it seems like the Democratic Party hasn't really done, at least some of the leaders haven't done the job they should do. Universities are caving in. Law firms are caving in. I mean, some people might literally not have a choice, but again, what are your institutions doing? What can be done? What should be done?
One thing I used to say all the time when I was the special representative, and it used to surprise people because I would say, you know, my government hasn't always gotten it right, but American civil society always does. American civil society has always pushed the United States government to live up to those values that we espouse. And so in this moment, yes, we may see disappointing responses from academic institutions, from law firms, from others in Congress. I can't speak for the Democratic Party. I'm not a representative of the Democratic Party. But we see courage from civil society, including from SPLC. Mm-hmm. And so that's what gives me hope. And one of the things I planned to do when I left on January 17th was to take a break. I just wanted to take a long nap. I wanted to not, have to travel. I wanted to enjoy my infant child. And I have not done that because I couldn't just sit back and not do anything. And so what happened was organically I started organizing some of my former colleagues whose work was directly under attack. Those of us who represented, who worked on behalf of, who partnered with marginalized communities around the world, with indigenous peoples, people of African descent, LGBTQI+ folks, women and girls in all their diversity, which is now no longer allowed to be said, people who were trafficked in persons, labor unions. We all got together and we said, we have to do something. And so what happened, what started out as something organically has grown into something where we said, you know what, this is a thing and we need to continue it. And we need to push back on these attacks on diplomacy as an institution, right? On the need for, or the importance of global engagement. We need to push back on that narrative that America first is what our foreign policy should be. And we need to push back on this idea that we don't need anybody else, on this idea that America can just bully everyone into submission. And so we are creating something. We're still figuring out what that is, but we will not be silent while human rights are completely undermined around the world and at home. We will not be silent while career diplomats are being demonized as, as woke or anti-American. We will not be silent as we really leave people behind by pulling foreign assistance out with such cruelty from underneath them, in somehow claiming that it won't make a difference and no one will die and somehow Americans will still be safer and more prosperous without this. We won't be silent when we see this. So we are building something, and I hope that that something will come together very soon so that I can give you more details about what it is that we are.
Coming from a museum, it's a scary time right now. Now, we are not the Smithsonian, so we're not a federal museum, and we have a lot of wonderful supporters. We are, fortunately or unfortunately, in the middle of a huge expansion where we are redoing 7 new galleries. One of those galleries is called Broken Promises. It actually tells this very story from Reconstruction to January 2020 about this cycle of progress and backlash that happens. We are the showers of Dr. Martin Luther King's papers. We tell the story of the civil rights movement. We have a family gallery. We have a lot going on internally to support our projects, and we're not going anywhere either. We are not being silent. We have dedicated people in the community, and we have dedicated staff. Doesn't mean they're not scared. Doesn't mean that we're not sure what happens if school children can't come in our doors when we open up in the fall. That is a possibility. So how are we thinking to make sure that we have curriculum? We have an online portal for teachers that's free for across the country. We send out trunks to schools across the country with the curriculum. So, within the industry, we are very, very committed. It doesn't mean we're not going to have some bumpy years ahead of us. But just like history has shown, you know your history, they came for the museums, they came for the libraries, they came for the schools. You still exist. We're bigger, we're a blimp in time, and we're going to have dedicated people to make sure that we are, one, preserving our history, continuing to search our history, and most importantly, educate the next generation.
Mm-hmm. You helped us get back on the right track, as we also, this isn't a part of that. We talked about the mission of amerikahaus with all the problems of American foreign policy and public diplomacy. And Margaret, you are also, just to add to that, you're also an institution that's like 100% based on donations, right? So you don't get any. No. So have you seen a rise in support?
Actually, we have. We've seen our supporters step up quite significantly, and we've already almost raised the budget for the year because people are so concerned about what's happening. I will tell you some of the ways that we're seeking to respond. First of all, we're doing litigation. We are exploring various cases against some of the executive orders that have been announced. Even before this administration, we were fighting, for example, in the sphere of education. We're representing a teacher who was fired in Georgia for reading a book to her classroom. The children's book is called My Shadow is Purple. And it's about a young person whose parents have blue and pink shadows, but their shadow is purple, and they want to be accepted for who they are. So she got fired for reading the book to her classroom, and we're representing her in court. We're also suing the Florida government, where we also did polling and learned that 70-some% of parents with kids in public schools in Florida absolutely do not support any censorship of books. And so we're working on litigation in Florida to stop some of the legislative efforts there. But we're also doing educational work. And one of the amazing legacies from the civil rights movement was a program called Freedom Schools. So many young people in the South never learned the true history about enslaved populations, how many of them did fight, how many of them did resist, how many of them left and found new lives. And so during the summertime of the civil rights movement era, many volunteers went down, learned true history, and shared them with communities across the South. And the communities became the educators. This was not information you could get in public schools, so this was information that the community taught. And we're now working, our program called Learning for Justice is working to create curriculum that allows communities to teach their kids accurate history, which is so desperately needed in our states of the South, who are denying all of the things we've been talking about here in the classroom. So we're looking at other ways to try to be responsive on that as well.
I really like the phrase you used when you said within our industry, we're very committed. And I think that's true for a lot of organizations, that you catch criticism because you're not doing everything for everybody. So I think for many of us, it's, okay, what do we mean within our industry we are very committed? How can we husband our resources, but also how can we maintain the legitimacy? The American Historical Association has very little money. We have no ability to influence anybody's job. We can't get anybody a job. We can't get anybody fired. We can't get them a raise. We cannot influence, we don't have connections in the State Department. We cannot influence foreign policy. We have three levers: the power to convene, the power to legitimate, and the power to inspire. And we try to use those things. So, for example, briefing Congress on history. We can do that only if we stick to the industry that we have that legitimacy in. That if we emphasize, this is our expertise. And we also try to make sure that it's not a matter of left and right. So, for example, when the San Francisco public schools created a commission to rename schools, they did a horrible job. They appointed a commission. The commission did not ask a single historian about the 44 schools, the names. They were going to rename a school named after Paul Revere for reasons that had nothing to do with anything. I can't even remember where they had a database, a spreadsheet. And when a reporter asked them, well, did you consult any historians? They said, no, we know what they would have said. So we issued a statement saying, no, this is not good history. And so part of what we've been doing is trying to emphasize that we can be most effective if we stand up for history with integrity. And so the work that we're doing with teachers, it's called Teaching History with Integrity. We got some money from a foundation to actually find out what's being taught in the public schools, and found out that, in fact, both the left and the right were speaking without knowing anything. That, in fact, very few teachers were using the 1619 Project, which upset the people.
Can you say a few words about it?
It's a very controversial set of curriculum materials produced by something called the Pulitzer Center, based on a New York Times Magazine issue a few years ago. It is very controversial for various reasons. It is not our job to say whether it's good or bad, but it was our job to find out how many teachers are using it, how many teachers are still teaching the old stuff on Reconstruction, which we thought that's what we would find out, actually, that there was a lot of teachers out there still teaching racist Reconstruction history. We were dead wrong. It turns out that most teachers are actually teaching pretty straightforward stuff. Most teachers do not want to stick their neck out politically. They are teaching basically the stuff that they learned in college, out of the textbook. It's very straightforward. When teachers on Sunday night don't know much about what they're teaching on Monday, where do they go? They go to very radical partisan sources. No, not even that. The Library of Congress, the National Archives, the evil Smithsonian Institution. This is where they go. So what we've been trying to do is to say, we are historians. This is where we have our expertise. And we're going to try to do the kinds of research, the kind of work. Every state, every 6-7 years, revises its standards for social studies teachers. This is something we can intervene in. This is something where we can have some influence in. So we got a grant. We are able to, every time a state now starts its revisions, we send people to testify. We take a look at what they're doing. So I think for all of us, it's where can we be effective?
Yeah, that's right.
And how can we be honest?
Yeah.
I think that's the only way we'll have a chance of pushing back on what's going on in the United States, right? I can't remember who to attribute this to, but I think someone early on in January, after the slew of executive orders was coming out, they said, don't think of yourself having to be the wall to protect against all of this. Think of yourself as one of the bricks in the wall. And where can I fit in as a brick? Where can I be the strongest, most effective brick? And that's how I've been viewing it.
That's a great image. I like that.
Before I open up to questions from the audience, and I'm very happy to see how you all are not of course not want to give up. Where do you think though that in your work you underestimated the power of what's coming? Where things maybe you or your organization should have done things differently, not seeing what maybe like. I don't know. Do you see where certain mistakes might have even been made?
The vote. I mean, our voice in our system is the vote. And when we talk about the civil rights era, the reason all of that legislation came brown, we had a Democratic presidency, legislative, and a Supreme Court that was the Warren Court. That's not by coincidence, okay? That's when we had a lot of this progression happening and progress in our history in the 1960s. Now look at our makeup when things are being reversed. We have Supreme Court with Trump had 3 seats. We have the legislature, which is predominantly Republican, and we have the Trump administration. It's almost the reverse picture. And so we still have the vote. Can't do much about Supreme Court appointments right now, okay, even though that's supposed to be, nonpartisan. And we have the administration we have, but we still have the House and the Senate. we still have an opportunity to have that checks and balances that our system was built upon. I think what's shocking for me the most, besides the history piece, is the failure of our democracy right now. I mean, in my past life, I was an attorney. I am an attorney. I'm a retired attorney, I guess, or a recovering attorney, and I taught law school. And I never fully understood how tenuous our system is until the past 8 years. And it is scary. And so we have to remember that no vote, if you don't go out and vote, is a vote. And we have to start teaching people that there is a power in the vote. Because how else are we, right now, there's a trifecta of power in this direction. And I don't believe in my heart that it represents the majority. I don't know how the rest of you feel.
I think one of our other challenges that we didn't pay enough attention to is the damage that disinformation has caused over the last 10 years. Disinformation, misinformation. The far right is extremely good at utilizing misinformation and disinformation in ways that cause so much harm. And we are behind. We are not reaching audiences in the same way with a positive message, with a vision of what our country could be, and so we're playing catch-up now. And many of the social media platforms are owned by the oligarchs and are not actually helping us counter. So I think that is a real challenge. That is probably the biggest challenge facing our democracy, is how do we get accurate information, accurate history in front of people to help them understand what's happening at a time when there's so many different circles of information, and it's very hard for people to know what's true and what's not true. So I think that's a big challenge for us.
That kind of sifting is something that we haven't done a good job of teaching. I think I'm the oldest person up here. When I was in school, you were taught how to find information. That was the challenge for history especially, but other disciplines too. So you were taught how to go to the library and how to find information, and it was a lot of work to find information. Now we have to teach students not how to find information, but how to sift information. And I think we didn't realize how hard that is. And in part because what folks like Christopher Rufo, for example, are very good at is they're very good at finding something that's true and making it sound as if it's normal. So they'll find an example of something a teacher does in some school district somewhere, and they will promote that and say, this is what's happening all over. So what they've said is not untrue, but it is disinformation in the sense that it is using a fact as a piece of information that is not really, it's the information as a generality is incorrect. And I think we've underestimated how effective that is. I think you're right about that.
I honestly don't know if I could have done anything differently to anticipate for just how crazy this foreign policy is. I mean, who would have thought that we would be making enemies with Canada? It's just bizarre, right? And, right now we have a foreign policy that is essentially based on the whims of the president. And that is very unpredictable. It's very unstable. And so, this is, I don't think anyone, it is completely normal and appropriate for any new administration to do policy reviews, right? Obviously, that's normal. But to completely dismantle an entire foreign assistance agency like USAID, essentially overnight, is just shocking, particularly since traditionally foreign assistance has been very bipartisan. And so I don't think I was prepared for the complete capitulation of Republicans in Congress who had traditionally championed the value of providing foreign assistance, who have traditionally valued bipartisan relationships, close relationships with the EU, with Canada, right, with our traditional allies. And I don't know how we come back from that.
But why? I've tried to understand the why. I mean, even Congress or the Senate has the power to, you know, the only one who was not nominated was Matt Gaetz, and then there was one case with Hexet where there was a tie, and then Vance had the decisive vote. Mitch McConnell, who is responsible for some of the mess we're in, at least said there is a limit to what I can do. Why aren't some, like Susan Collins from Maine, I looked it up, you know, she's been in Congress since the mid-1990s. She's 72 years old. You know, with others, maybe, no, I'm just meaning others, you know, maybe you can see they are worried about the career. Are people, I mean, that's one argument I heard. People are afraid what will happen to them and maybe their families if they stick out there. You would?
Yes, there is. I have heard from people who are aware that, yes, that there are people who are afraid of physical safety. I mean, I attempt, for good reason. I mean, I'm tempted to ask, but I won't. How many people in this audience, going back to when you were 4 years old, can remember being bullied? And when you don't stand up to a bully, and part of the problem, I think that's what is going on. These people are being bullied, and how do you stand up to a bully? Usually, it has to be collective. You don't have 50 college presidents saying before the money is withdrawn from Columbia, saying we support Columbia. And so I think that is part of the problem, is the smart strategy of picking people off one by one. But I think in Congress it's intimidation. And it's right when you say I would never have imagined that a program that was what George Bush has publicly said one of his proudest achievements is the work that his administration did in sub-Saharan Africa in public health.
Through PEPFAR, specifically, PEPFAR.
You would know more than I.
The President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. It was started by Bush, and it has been overwhelmingly bipartisan and incredibly successful.
And he considers it to be his proudest achievement, is my understanding. And yet, where is the Bush family? Where are the people who implemented that program as it is being dismantled?
Okay, I want to open up the floor to discussions. Let's maybe start here, and while we do this, I'll also look whether we got anything online. Oh, okay.
Can you share the microphone?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So, any questions from, yes, the gentleman over there. Just wait for a second to get the microphone,
A question for the gentleman at the center. When you introduced your work, you said you give history lessons for members of Congress. I think that is a very...
No, staff, not members.
Oh, staff members.
Staff, not members, no.
Oh, I was wondering if the staff members are asked to go into your lessons, or can they do it voluntarily? I can imagine there are some people who are more interested in history and others they are less interested.
Yeah, we publicize this we do not expect any members of Congress to show up at our briefings. It is enough a challenge to get staff. To get staff, you have to have food. You have to make sure that you hold these briefings in congressional office buildings. They will not walk 2 blocks. And you have to make sure that you hold it at a time when it is convenient for staff. So it is hard enough to get staff to attend, but no, we do not expect ever to get a member to attend one of our congressional briefings.
Yes, there's a question over there.
Thank you for the panel. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I was just wondering if anyone could speak to Trump's attacks on constitutional amendments, specifically the 14th Amendment, and how also that has ramifications for other marginalized communities, specifically the trans community, like in Iowa, that just recently had their civil rights removed as well. And yeah, thank you.
Sure.
You have two lawyers.
So the attack on the 14th Amendment is an attack on...
What is the 14th Amendment
is an
about?
attack on
Okay.
birthright
Okay.
citizenship, which is one of the most important distinguishing characteristics of the American democracy. If you're born in the United States, you're a citizen, you have the right to vote and participate in our democracy. This has been a boogeyman for President Trump since his first term, and he's been seeking ways to overturn it. He actually cannot overturn it with his executive order, so just to be clear, that will not stand. But it is a signal that he is intending to go after birthright citizenship, and he is already putting pressure on members of Congress to introduce legislation that would remove birthright citizenship, which is a very interesting question. They've already been challenging some of the births recently in some hospitals in the South. We've had government agents who've come in and challenged the birth certificate for people born to foreign nationals in the hospitals. This is going to be an ongoing issue for us. And I'm sure they're waiting for the right case to bring it all the way up to the Supreme Court. It's also really hard to imagine that they could overturn this, but I have been wildly surprised many times over the last few years, so I will never say never. But this is a challenge that feels really quite difficult to make legally. And I'll ask my fellow.
Yeah. There are a lot of things happening right now that
We would
my
never
law
have
degree,
dreamed. Yeah,
it baffles me. Disbanding some of these organizations like ILMNS, these are organizations that were put together by Congress. So as a president, he can cripple the money, but you can't disband an organization, but yet things are happening. And what scares me, and this is why I talked about this in the balance of power in the United States, right? We're having the three branches in this beautiful, Marbury v. Madison balance, is we have a Supreme Court that have three justices that are appointed by Trump. Unheard of in the history of the United States that one president, and so this goes up through our system, but it takes a long time, many years, for all the things that are going to have to be challenged. And we need organizations like yours and ACLU and they're going to court every day. Every order that comes down, it's going to have to go through our system. That's how we work. I just want to make sure we have a system and a check and balances so that happens. Mm-hmm. And this is going to be with us for many, many years. To undo this, to actually have the opinions. And you're seeing it now. You're seeing it on the first level of courts. You're seeing it on state courts. This is our system. But the pounding of the first couple of months of his administration is keeping lawyers very busy. I will tell you, as a lawyer, the hardest part, and I'm not practicing, so, I am now with museums, but, it breaks my heart when I look at people in Congress who have law degrees, because I know, we are supposed to be loyal to the Constitution and protect our rights. And I am still baffled. I don't care if he's blackmailing you. We took an oath to uphold the Constitution and not the person sitting in the seat. And there is a breakdown in our system right now. And maybe this is why I'm so happy that we're here, because maybe we can learn from your history here in Germany. Mm-hmm. There's a lot to be learned. There are echoes of history being repeated in the United States right now that, had you asked me 10 years ago, I would say this would never happen.
Oh, just today when we walked around or heard things, from the book burnings or taking books out of libraries to many other. I think I can combine two questions here. One is regarding disinformation. Truth often involves nuance. Lies can be simpler and sensationalist. How can your organizations and areas of expertise work against this? Or some bullies need a punch in the mouth. How can civil society punch back? Who wants to take the first punch?
You want to do that?
Yes, here's my first punch. I think the disinformation piece is so important. And this is something I used to say all the time in my old role with my counterparts from around the world. The other side, and it's not, I will just say the extreme sort of right wing, the folks that believe in the supremacy of white, straight Christian men and that hierarchy, they are really good at sharing talking points, at keeping their messages very simple, even if they're lies, keeping the messages very simple and clear to understand. You can't afford eggs, it's because that immigrant is taking your job. What? It doesn't even make sense. But it's clear, right? And they're all using this very similar variations of that clear talking point. Meanwhile, on the other side, the people who believe that every human being is worthy of equal rights and dignity, we are talking all the way up here. We're talking about lofty democracy. What does that mean when I can't afford a carton of eggs to feed my child, right? We need to do a better job of simplifying the message, making it clear as day to people, to the average person, why this matters. Why does foreign policy matter to you? Why does us giving foreign assistance to a young orphan in Ethiopia make you safer, right? And so until we do that, we're going to continue to lose the narrative. And that is one thing that I'm very excited about, my new initiative, because that's going to be one of our main things, is really talking to people, talking to the average American about foreign policy, about diplomacy, and why it matters to them, and why it keeps the average American in Iowa safer and healthier and more prosperous.
So, that's so great. Sorry, I'm still thinking about what you said.
It's hard to follow. That's
I
why.
know. In terms of punching a bully, so if you've noticed, bullies usually travel in packs. They usually have a crew of people who stand around them and also look tough, right? And that's what Trump has done. He's surrounded himself with other bullies and a crew who will back him up. One of the most important things is to divide that group. Some of you may know that next Saturday, April 5th, there is a worldwide protest against Tesla and Musk. That's a way for you to express your own opinions if you have them. But the more that we can divide this group of people so that it's not seen as an overwhelming force, but it's actually people who are at odds and they're already doing that to one another, the more strength we will have in any pushback that we give. And then one other thing I'll say, you talked earlier about the power of the vote, and that is really how we started to overcome so many of the barriers that prevented people of color, women, and others from advancing. We're at real risk of losing our right to vote in the United States. They've, since the 2013 Supreme Court decision, the Shelby County, Alabama case, where they actually allowed states to introduce legislation that would make it harder for people to vote. This is now moving to a federal level because of the switch in party control of Congress. We're at real risk of losing the right to vote. And so at a time when we need the popular vote to have a voice more than ever, that's one of our biggest dangers. And so organizations that are fighting to ensure that people retain the right to vote, organizations that are fighting efforts to remove voting rights, move access. The latest executive order from the president over the weekend was to require that to register to vote, you must show a passport. And that automatically rules out anyone who doesn't do international travel, who doesn't have the resources to get a passport, who may live too far away and not have access to apply for a passport. That can't be a reason that somebody is denied the right to vote. So those are places where we're particularly focusing to try to break up this image or impression of overwhelming force that they're hoping to portray.
And I think that your earlier question about the importance of history and history education. My main field of scholarship was African American history, and when I used to teach undergraduates, and this is even 35, 40 years ago, it's much worse now, in terms of what students know about the right to vote and what it took. And I think part of the problem, and quite frankly, I think this is one of the reasons they're going after the Smithsonian, because the Smithsonian actually does a pretty good job of this, of helping people to understand what Jim Crow was. What was it like?
Not just the Smithsonian.
I know that, but they haven't gone after your museum yet. Just you wait.
After tonight, I'm in trouble.
But that's right. What they do, I mean, if you go to the National Museum of African American History, you actually do understand what it meant before the Civil Rights Act of 1963, not before the act, but before the act was enforced, which is a different thing. You guys know that better than I do. What it was like on a Sunday, if it had rained on Saturday night, for a black family going to church to be walking along the street, and a white person approaches them, they have to go and step into the gutter, into the mud, into the rain, on their way to church on Sunday morning. This is the sort of thing that if you go to I hate to say the average American, but you go to most Americans and ask if they are aware that this is what happened in the period before voting rights. If you ask them what it took for people to get voting rights, they have no idea. So I think part of it is that people don't understand what's at stake here. And that's part of that history education, and that's part of what the Smithsonian does well.
I'd like to take one more question from the audience and then end with a combination of two questions that I got from those on the screens. And others in the audience, there's going to be reception. All of these people and many others who are part of this project are going to be here, so you can continue the conversation and ask a question. Irmgard, there at the front, I saw you first.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your talks, and I'm really happy to hear that you won't be, or that you are saying we are not silent, because from my point of view here in Germany, it looks like that in the States everyone is still on shock. And it's so that I was wondering what is going on. Why are why are there are not more people on the streets also? And I was wondering why I don't know so much about that, because it can be my fault, of course, but is this a problem of the media, that it's not enough on media, that we should go more public with all the things you're doing?
I actually think there's quite a bit happening already in the United States. Just to give an example, many of the executive orders have been targeting law firms and going after individual law firms for their work. And already 2 of them have responded by filing lawsuits. One of them has already been agreed to by a judge, has put an injunction in place. The other one literally turned around a response in 24 hours and just filed their claim against. So they're not waiting. They're not hoping that it doesn't happen. They're actually preparing to fight. Even though this is going to cost them a tremendous amount in their business, even though they're in trouble because of these executive orders, they're not going down willingly. So you heard a lot about the one law firm that did cave and did agree, but there are others who are already fighting. If you watch social media in the United States, you will see that there are protests happening around the country. They're not getting a lot of mainstream coverage, some, but there are protests happening really, if not every day, every week in places across the country. There's also vandalization of Teslas happening all over the country. But there's also just a lot of public protest. When we see the consequences of the tariffs, when we see the consequences of the other poor economic policies start to hit more and more Americans, you are also going to see a very different response. And if any of you have watched the coverage of town halls, okay, when Congress is taking a break from legislating, not much, and going home to meet with constituents, they're all being yelled at. Democrats and Republicans. They're all receiving a tremendous amount of public outrage, and that is getting a lot of media coverage. So there are people who are speaking out now. It's not as coordinated or organized, but there's some scientific research that shows that if 1.5% of the population engages in public protest, it will actually start to shift the policies. 1.5% is what we're aiming for. Actually, we want to go much higher, but just saying, We're aiming to get there so that people have to take it very, very seriously, and members of Congress will have to change their tune because they will lose their seats if they don't actually step up and take action. So take heart, Irmgard.
There's a question here about this project and whether what we're doing here, whether this is a longer one. Actually, this is just the first day of us together, and of basically a week, and we also, the plan is that 25 plus 25, again a busload, will be in the US later this year in September and October, going to Atlanta, Birmingham, Montgomery, Savannah, Georgia, and Washington, D.C. So this is a more long-term project, and I also hope, or that is one of the ideas, to have more deeper connections. And that brings another question in here. What can, well, and Desiree, you talked about, well, we can't do it alone. What, and we've talked about Amerika-Haus and what the United States did for Germany. What can others do to help? Not just historians. Here.
Well, first, thank you for your question, because I live there and I struggle with this as well. But to your point, there's a lot going on. We haven't been strategic as we need to be. We haven't had, if you look at going back to history and you look at the civil rights movement, there was strategy. We had a person, we had MLK, but there are many foot soldiers that were doing that work. And we aren't there yet, and I don't know what it's going to look like in the modern time. But to your point, something has to happen a little more strategic, because little pockets are happening. But how can you support us? Social media is international, voicing that way. The march that you all had, a couple of, that visibility, financial. All of these organizations takes money and being plummeted. And as you see, these orders are stripping great organizations from support. And so $10, $5, send it to organizations that that are going to court. It's really important to keep the fight going is very costly. And so these are ways from afar you can support. And don't be afraid to visit us. Don't be afraid to come. We're looking so forward to you coming to the United States.
There are also many cities in Germany that have sister relationships with places in the United States. Yeah. I actually think this is an amazing time to do some collaboration, to invite people from the United States to come and learn from your history. I mean, the experience for us, even just for one day, has already been really compelling. It gives us a different vantage point on what's happening. So to share information, to invite people to come to visit your sister city and provide information that you can share from your own experiences would be remarkably helpful right now.
And also share your perspectives of how you're viewing us, right? I think a lot of Americans, I think a lot of Americans don't appreciate how the world is viewing us, and the shock and horror with which they're viewing us, the confusion with which they're viewing us. I don't think many Americans appreciate that, and I think that matters, right? One of the things that I'm deeply concerned about is the ramifications on Americans, just the average Americans who travel abroad, right? I think there's going to be a dangerous rise in anti-Americanism. And I fear for what that means for my fellow citizens, who by no fault of their own, right, are levying these tariffs, who by no fault of their own are trying to acquire Greenland, right? But who no fault of their own kicked out of the country the South African ambassador. I mean, this is dangerous stuff, and I don't think that my fellow Americans appreciate how bad things are in terms of the global perceptions of America, of what's happening to our country and Americans, and how that will impact our own safety, frankly, as well as our own economic well-being. And I think this is something that can break through the noise, right? Because at the end of the day, people care about how it impacts them, how it impacts their wallet. And I think if they realize that, oh, wait, we're no longer welcome to travel as tourists in some of these places. When we start having visa requirements, I think people are going to wake up, right? And so I do think it's useful for you all to share with us how you are viewing what's happening. I think we need that dose of reality.
I like that perspective on the positive, that it does take courage to stand up to a bully, and it's nice to send money. Please send money. But there's another reason for that, which is anybody who stands up to this particular bully has to, especially if you're part of a nonprofit, the board in the United States, the governing board of a nonprofit organization is legally responsible to think first of that organization, not of their moral responsibilities to God, not of their political perspective, not of their own moral gyroscope. They are legally responsible for the well-being of that organization. What that means is that when you're standing up to the bully, and you know the bully can revoke what is known in the United States as 501c3 status. In other words, the Internal Revenue Service can determine, and pressure from the executive is not hard at the Internal Revenue Service, can determine that any of us can lose our tax-deductible status, our tax-free status. So yes, send money, that'll help. But also it means that it takes courage. And it's easier to do something courageous if you hear people saying thank you. You're doing something good. Because all of our organizations, I'm guessing, I know ours, are called all sorts of nasty things in public, social media, wherever. And I'm retiring on June 30th, and my replacement refers to this as needing a duck's back. When the question was, do you really want to do this job? And part of her answer was, well, yeah, I've developed my duck's back. It's easier to have that duck's back, to have things roll off you, if you at least know that some people out there are happy with what you're doing. So I think that's one thing, is take a look at the organizations in the United States that are trying to stand up and somehow let them know that you appreciate it.
Okay, thank you so much. I must say I don't envy you, of course, but I'm encouraged, and I think others too, by your will to resist, to stand up. If we can be of any assistance or help, and you indicated some things, let us know. Thank you for at least partly restoring truth and sanity today. And thank you all for coming. Again, there's going to be a reception. There's a chance to ask more questions. Thank you for everyone online, and thank you for the host. Have a good evening.